This recording is a part of the Week 2 series on program evaluation. We'll first begin by reviewing the first 4 steps of the UFE process, but primarily this particular video will cover step 5 of UFE. Here is the graphic organizer that talks about the entire series of Week 2. Again, specifically this video will focus on Step 5 tonight, where we will identify and prioritize primary intended users by determining the priority purposes of a UFE evaluation. Later videos will focus on Step 6 and Step 7. With the entire series of Week 2, we'll first review Steps 1 through 4 of UFE, and then we'll learn UFE Steps 5 through 7 and how they're integrated into Steps 1 through 4, as we learned that UFE is not a linear process, but all of the steps are very much integrated. And then we'll compare and contrast what we've learned about UFE to our real-time program evaluations we conduct in our school districts. And then at the end of Week 2, I'll introduce the UFE final project. Just to review a little bit of what we learned in last week, Week 1, we learned that UFE framework is all about perspective taking. For example, this is an analogy. If you look at the 2x4s on the ground, how many 2x4s do you see? While some of you see 3 2x4s, others of you see 4. So it's a matter of our perspective. So this is what Daniel Pink says, is that we continually in an evaluation process have to take into consideration as the evaluation facilitator the perspective of others. And that's what UFE is about. You as the evaluation facilitator are continuously throughout the whole UFE process taking a look at perspectives of others, your primary intended users. This diagram we learned about in Step 1. When we work with our primary intended users, it's also not only taking in the perspectives of others throughout the entire process, but we're continually adapting to those perspectives. So this active, reactive, interactive, adaptive stance characterizes all phases of the evaluator and user interactions, from initially identifying primary intended users to focusing relevant questions, choosing methods, and always analyzing those results. All phases of UFE involve a collaborative process of action, reaction, interaction, adaptation, as evaluators and intended users consider their options throughout the whole process. And we get better at this as we gain experience as evaluation facilitators. This is the overall definition of utilization-focused evaluation we discussed in Week 1. So evaluation is always used by the intended user, and that's the sole purpose of UFE. If not, then the likelihood of those results being used are minimized. So UFE is highly personal in situation. It's always a process between the evaluator and their primary intended users. So we're always fitting the evaluation to a particular situation or context. And again, we learned that it's not a linear process. With Step 4 of situation analysis, it continually involves that step impacting Steps 1, 2, and 3. For example, in Step 1, we're always analyzing the program situation. In Step 2, you as evaluator are always analyzing the evaluator situation. And in Step 3, we're always analyzing the stakeholder situation. Let's go ahead and begin learning about UFE Step 5. Step 5 in the process is focusing on the evaluation purpose, and oftentimes with that purpose, we're aligning questions to the type or purpose of the evaluation. Here it is in a more linear process with showing steps 1 through 7, where step 5 with a red arrow, we're identifying and prioritizing the primary intended users to make purpose distinctions. So with step 5, this is another example in steps 1 and 2 where the issue of purpose will already have surfaced. So as you're determining programming readiness and evaluator readiness, you're actually saying to yourselves, well, what's really the purpose of our evaluation? So different evaluation purposes require different kinds of readiness. For example, when you're getting feedback by your users from a survey, that's many times different than evaluation of the effectiveness of an intervention. It's important to remember that in this model, you as the evaluation facilitator, you're not identifying the purpose, but you're identifying that purpose in collaboration with your primary intended users. You may have to guide them and educate them on the 6 different types of purposes that we're going to learn about in just a moment, but it's a negotiated process between you and the primary intended users. So, in the evaluation, oftentimes the purpose might be for accountability, program improvement, or it might be for identification of best practices to expand or replicate a model. So let's get into the 6 types of purposes of the evaluation that are discussed on pages 129 through 131 of your book. These pages are in the form of a chart, menu 5.1, where they're talking about the primary uses of the evaluation findings. So let's take a look at each one of these individually. The first one is summative judgment-oriented evaluation, and we all can relate to this. We've all had the experience of a summative evaluation where we're judging the overall effectiveness of the program. And oftentimes that decision is focused on whether or not we continue the program or terminate the program. And in working with your primary intended users, you really, in a summative evaluation, need to first select the criteria for rendering the summative judgment. After you've done that, then you and your PIUs need to set standards of performance that must be met to be considered successful. Once the standards of performance have been set, step 3 involves measuring the performance and comparing those results to targets. And then, of course, the last step is pulling all of those results together and synthesizing them into some kind of a summative judgment or value. The next type of evaluation is a formative or improvement-oriented type of evaluation, where you're focusing on improving the program and enhancing the program, rather than determining a final definitive judgment about the effectiveness. So there's always room for improvement, right? So often these kinds of evaluations are just a part of doing business in a school district where we're always focused on continuous improvement. And the author likens that to when the chef tastes the soup, that's more of a formative approach or evaluation. However, when the guest tastes the soup, then that's more summative. The third type of evaluation talked about on page 129 is accountability. So that has to do with oversight and compliance. I think of Missouri School Improvement Program reviews. That's a type of accountability evaluation. You might think of this related to special services, reviews, accountability reviews, also with federal programs. But the program often is to determine whether or not that's in compliance. So what was achieved and how and why was achieved at the level attained, so that we can demonstrate, the purpose is to demonstrate that resources are well managed and efficiently attain desired results. A fourth type of evaluation is monitoring, where it focuses on data for program improvement. Again, I think of federal Title I and title program evaluations as well as special services, but it can inform managers on a weekly, monthly, or quarterly basis on how critical indicators are moving, and that's the best way to keep up with monitoring types of evaluations, that you're not just waiting for DESE to come around to monitor your program, but you have that checklist in front of you all the time so that you can see that you're in compliance and those indicators are moving in a positive direction. So data are typically reported comparing time periods, and again, this talks about the ongoing monitoring serving our managers well, so that we know if there's any attention that is needed with any of those indicators that are being monitored. The fifth type of evaluation that maybe we're not as familiar with in school districts is called the knowledge generating evaluation, where we're looking not only at progress in our own school district with a particular program, but we're looking across findings from different programs to identify general patterns of effectiveness and lessons for use in future initiatives. So it's the process of synthesizing results from various studies. The sixth type of evaluation is called a developmental evaluation. And this type of evaluation is much more ongoing, could be ongoing over several years, where you're changing your model by adapting it to change circumstances and emergent conditions. So they don't, developmental-oriented evaluators don't necessarily expect stabilization, because they are aware that conditions are constantly changing as participants change, as conditions change, as learning change, and as the context changes. So that's an interesting one for you to look at, because it really, the purpose is all focused on adaptation in complex, emergent, and dynamic conditions. Here I thought I would just pull up menu 5.1 to look at it more specifically in terms of the different columns, where this will serve useful to you, where you might even want to share this menu with your primary intended users to educate them on the different types of evaluations. Because remember, you're not determining the evaluation purpose. It's you're doing that in collaboration with your primary intended users. So this is a good education tool to use with them, not only because it identifies the purposes, but also because it identifies the different types of questions that go with each different type of evaluation. So you can use these questions with your primary intended users, as well as the different approaches to the different types and the different factors that affect use of the evaluation. So if you use this at the very beginning, especially to determine readiness of whether or not the program is ready to be evaluated, this is a very helpful chart to use with your primary intended users. And here are monitoring and developmental uses, questions, approaches, and factors affecting use for monitoring and developmental evaluations. And then on page 31, the knowledge generation evaluation. Menu 5.2 on page 132 is also important, and you can use this with your primary intended users, because it talks about the different types again, the different types of users of the evaluation. For instance, summative evaluation users are much different than formative evaluation users, where summative evaluations involve mainly funders of the evaluations, such as your Board of Educations, your policymakers, maybe central office, as opposed to your formative evaluation, where that involves those people who use the program on a day-to-day basis. And we've also talked about what's at stake with evaluations. We talked about that in week 1, where summative is more of a high-stakes evaluation compared to formative evaluations, which are more lower stakes. You might agree or disagree with the different types of evaluations and whether or not they're low stakes or high stakes. I think it again depends on the context of your school district and the situations involving your school districts. For instance, in monitoring, I would have to really say that our Board of Education in the school district where I worked at really considered monitoring evaluations more high stakes and low stakes. They expected us to be in compliance with the different indicators and the expectations. So take a look at that and kind of analyze that in your own school district. No matter what type of evaluation purpose or use of that evaluation, we have to remember that no matter what type, the evaluation findings are usually just one piece of the decision-making pie, not the whole pie, because there are different technical and methodology weaknesses, data must be interpreted, contextual factors must be taken into consideration. And as a part of UFE, no matter what type of evaluation, summative, purpose, developmental, there are complexities associated with each type of evaluation. And so we have to consider those things as we think about the likelihood that the findings are appropriately and meaningfully used. And it's important to talk about this at the very beginning of the evaluation process with your UFE primary intended users as they're thinking about the purpose and the type of evaluation that involves decision making. This graphic involves all 5 steps of the UFE process that we've talked about so far. And it's important to remember that it's always the focus on the intended uses and the purpose of the evaluation by the intended users. This is the last slide of step 5, where I'd like you to think about doing this activity to give you a better grasp internally in your mind of UFE and the 5 steps that you've used so far. I'd like you to identify a program for any type of a program evaluation that might be conducted in your school district. So on a piece of paper, I'd like you to identify any program that could be evaluated in your school district, and then identify the evaluation type or purpose of that evaluation, and identify 2 priority questions that would go along with that evaluation of this particular type of program that you're thinking about doing an evaluation on. And again, you can use menus 5.1 and 5.2 to complete this activity. So this is the conclusion of this particular video on step 5 of program evaluation, so that you are ready to move on to the next video, which talks about step 6.